So that should be presented desktop. Okay, you're going to record this session. Yes, I'm recording this session. Yeah. Do you mind? Or, yeah, that's good. Yeah. So any questions you ask, maybe for external students. So whenever we do a building, we can't just decide, all right, this is how we'll do it, and make all of those decisions ourselves. There are people who have authority over what we do, and there are also people that help us out with all the legal aspects. Well, there are various different people you can employ through the process all the way through. What we're going to be looking at in the first part of today's lesson is about some of the rules that apply to building, or the legal framework. So we're not going to be looking at the rules specifically. We just look at the whole list of the rules, and then as we go on, we get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of each of the rules as they apply to various different materials. So we have the National Construction Code, which tells us how we work. That provides the base standard for how we build. Now, we can build better than the National Construction Code if we so wish. So the National Construction Code would say things like for a bathroom, for a wet area, you are required to have waterproofing to 1500 millilitres from shower rose, for example. But we can go, well, let's waterproof the whole floor. So the National Construction Code sets out the base standards, the base requirements. We can go beyond that, but also the National Construction Code, yes, it is a very big document, but it talks about everything in a relatively brief fashion, and then references lots of other documents. The other documents it references are things like Australian standards and some other design guides and so on. So we've got the National Construction Code. That's split up into 2 volumes. Now, I think I spoke about the National Construction Code to you guys last week. Did you guys download a copy of that?
I tried to go into it, but it wouldn't let me download the 2019 one.
No, don't download the 2019 one yet. That's scheduled for it's being released for review, so you can go in there and you can have a look at it, but it doesn't become applicable until the 1st of May. So if we were to build a building today and design a building today, we design it and build it in accordance with the 2016 version, because the 2019 version doesn't become current until 1st of May, and that's if everything runs smoothly, which it may not. So it may actually be later on in the year.
So we search for the
2016. Yeah, so the 2016 version.
That's the 1694 Act 1684, isn't it?
No, that's the National Construction Code.
Okay.
So the National Construction Code, and there are 3 volumes to it. There's Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3. What we are concerned with in this class is Volume 1 and Volume 2. Volume 3 is for plumbing and electrical, or for building services. And then there's also a Volume 4, which is an explanatory volume. You can have a look at that. That provides commentary on the National Construction Code in, I guess, essentially an easier to read fashion. But our main reference is going to be Volume 1 and Volume 2. Those 2 volumes, within the National Construction Code, it classifies buildings into different classifications. So you have Class 1 buildings, which are your residential buildings, so a single dwelling being an attached house, or one or more attached dwellings, each being separated by a firewall. So I think we digressed a little bit last week into what is a firewall. So that fire separation wall, that's a wall that will maintain fire separation for 90 minutes in the case of a Class 1 building. So it won't fall down for 90 minutes, it won't let the passage of flame and hot gas through it for 90 minutes, it won't heat up on the other side for 90 minutes. So if we have, maybe let's say these are a series of row houses. Between those series of row houses, if we had a fire separation wall, they become a class 1 building. And then we can get separate title and sell those off separately. Well, that's if the council allows for the creation and subdivision of separate titles, etc. So that's class 1A. You also have class 1B, which is a boarding house. So that a small boarding house. So that has a maximum area of 300 square metres, where no more than 12 people would normally reside. So that they both come under class 1. Class 1, and then you've got class 10, which are non-habitable buildings or structures, things such as private garage, carport, shed, or the like. Typically, class 1 and class 10 buildings are built together. You build a house, you may build a garage on the site, or a studio, or a swimming pool, or a retaining wall, or a non-habitable structure. Because these two things are normally built together, they are bundled together in the Volume 2 National Construction Code. So, I'll just write that on the board as well to keep it clear. So we've got Volume 1 and then Volume 2. Under Volume 2 we've got Class 1 and 10. Under Volume 1 of the NCC, we've got Class 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. So Volume 1 covers commercial. These are commercial classifications. Volume 2 covers predominantly residential classifications. So Class 1 and Class 10. When you talk about farms and things like that, it gets a little bit murky, because when you've got garages and the like on a farm, like your class 10, that's where you normally be parking the family car and the ute and the motorbikes and things like that. But if you start putting trucks in there and headers and whatever, then it's no longer, if the intent is for that machinery, it's no longer class 10, because class 10 is for your things that are associated with your house, for those ancillary structures. If you're going to be parking things like that in there, it suddenly becomes a class 7 building. So class 1 and class 10, primarily residential and ancillary buildings. Other classifications, things such as shops, offices, restaurants, cafes, factories, warehouses, and the like. This diagram is taken from the National Construction Code, which sort of shows what our building classifications are. So class 1, houses, townhouses. Class 2, well, that says flats. That I'm not sure if that says flats now in the new National Construction Code. That's a bit of a definitional thing. Typically, when people refer to a block of flats, they're referring to buildings that don't have fire separating walls and don't have separate titles. When you create fire separating walls and separate titles, you can then call them units and apartments, because they can be sold off separately. So that's just a little definitional thing. But class 2, basically that's multi-residential, where you've got a whole bunch of residences all joined together within the one building. And an important part of that definition is you have residences on top of other residences. So that means it's not only about fire separation walls, but fire compartmentalisation with your ceilings as well. So that ceiling has to reach 90, 90, 90, or in some cases, when it's a larger development, it's 180, 180, 180. So for 180 minutes, resist the passage of fire in certain tests. So, and I mentioned boarding houses coming under class 1 for 12 occupants or less. If we've got more than 12 occupants, then we have to go into this classification, which is class 3, which also includes hotels, motels, etc. So your larger accommodation where you've got people that don't know each other, don't necessarily know each other.
Then you've got class 5 for your offices and class 6 for shops, but sometimes you'll have a class 4 building with, sometimes you'll have a residence within an office. Has anybody ever seen that before? You have an office block and you've got the caretaker's residence on the roof. So that caretaker's residence on the roof, typically rented out to students and whatever nowadays because you don't have on-site caretakers in offices, but that comes under as a class 4. So it's typically a residential use, but because they're included within very large developments, you've got to have other access and egress and fire separation requirements more than what you do have for your class 1. Then class 7 car parks and warehouses, class 8 factories and the like, that's more for manufacturing. And then class 9 healthcare, assemblies, schools, aged care, nursing homes, etc. And class 10 garages, sheds and the like. So this site here being the former Mitsubishi factory, what classification do you think it used to be? Anybody? Class 8, yeah. So it used to be a class 8 building, and what is it now?
Probably under school.
Yeah, if you're under school, it's So for all your institutional buildings, so I would put it under 9B for assembly, schools, etc. So when it underwent renovation, and so all this stuff built, these concrete floors that are here now weren't here when it was a factory. So there's a lot of stuff, all the air conditioning, everything just got put in here. But another thing that had to happen was that the architects involved in doing the renovation would have had to have applied with the council for a change of classification. You can't just go, all right, yeah, you're going to take this building and then it was a factory, but I want to live there and make it my house. You can't, well, some people do simply do that and the council doesn't pick up on it, but to follow the letter of the law, you've actually got to put in an application for that claim change of classification. And when you put in that application for change of classification, this building, for example, the council would have said, okay, well, it used to be a factory, but now it's got a lot of students in there, a lot of people that have to evacuate. Do you have evacuation plans in place? Do you have fire suppression features? Do you have access for disabled? Do you have a warning system in the event of an emergency, etc.? So do you have enough toilets? So as a factory, you have different requirements, number of toilets per person. You also got different car parking requirements. So council would say, we want to see that you've addressed all of those things before we allow you to use it as a school or to have that change of classification. So all the buildings, so the council has a say in what we can do and what we can build. First of all, we have acts of parliament. So it's not just the federal government. So we have in Australia we have several tiers of government. We've got federal government, which is all of Australia. We have state government, which is all your various different states, and then we have local government. Within South Australia, so we've got our South Australian government. They will pass various different acts, and some of those acts relate to what we do as a profession. One of them is the Building Work Contractors Act, which tells, how you can operate as a building work contractor, etc. The other one is the Planning Act. So that Planning Act sets out sets out the parameters in which local councils can impose a zoning, and they can impose that zoning on various different parcels of land to say you can do this or you can do that on this parcel of land. And they do that via their development plans. So each separate council has a separate development plan. there's a lot of commonality between the development plans. Like if I pick up the development plan for Charles Sturton and the development plan for Mitcham, probably a lot of the stuff is the same, except for, you know, some of the different councils, they will, you know, have specific aspects that relate only to them. Like Adelaide Hills Council, they worry about contamination of water sources that come down through the hills. They worry about bushfire. They worry about houses that can be seen from the Adelaide Plain here that are not sticking out from the hill, etc. West Torrens, they think about the airport, etc. So there's all these aspects that are, you know, specific to your various different councils, and those bits will differ between their development plans. But also you'll see a lot of commonality. Then, so they're the local government requirements. So we've got our state government and then our local councils. So local councils impose the zoning. However, if we were going to do a major project like this, it wouldn't just be up to the local council. It wouldn't be City of Marion that have something to do with this. We would have to be going through the state government as well, because they would want to have a stake. They would want to have a finger in this pie to say, this is what you want to be doing because it's part of the big picture. Also what controls what we do on a site are things called encumbrances. An encumbrance is anything that's lodged on a title. And have you guys seen certificates of title before?
I have.
Yeah.
But I haven't paid much attention to it.
Yeah, that's cool. That's fine. Yeah. No, don't blame me. But so a certificate of title that sets out what sets out what you own. If you purchase a parcel of land, you get your name on that certificate of title saying you've got this thing, right? You have that interest in the land. But we're not the only people that have an interest in the land. For example, let's say we go and I think certificate of title's the next one on here. But that's really hard to read. I'll bring up another one. So we go out and purchase a parcel of land, and then you know, under registered proprietor it says Joe Bloggs owns this piece of land. That's great. But the thing is, the Crown always has an interest in that land. The Crown being represented, also the Crown being the monarchy that we have in England, represented by the Australian government, can at any point in time compulsorily acquire that portion of land. They can say, we want to build a road here, Highways Department will compulsorily acquire your land, but they will pay you compensation for doing so. And then that compensation comes under what's called heads of compensation. There's various different methods in which they pay their compensation for disturbance, and they pay for actual dollar value per square metre as derived from other sales of other land, etc. So they will pay you compensation for that. But has anybody watched The Castle? No, it's one of my favourite movies. Oh yeah, okay. So yeah, Castle. Anyhow, so The Castle. That's what it's all about. I suggest if you've got some spare time, you don't want to be spending any time. Yeah, watch The Castle. It's an Australian classic. But basically, the thing about The Castle is, so you've got this very average family living next to an airport, and there's an airport expansion going on. So various different, like Minister for Infrastructure or something or other, compulsorily acquires their property with a bunch of other properties, and then they take the state government to court over that, about that compulsory acquisition. It's all about that process. But basically, there are in that movie they stop state government doing that. But basically, there are very few avenues in which that can be done. If state government wants to compulsorily acquire your land, they will compulsorily acquire your land. So, although as a purchaser you purchase that piece of land, you have an interest in that piece of land, there's always going to be an interest owned by the Crown as well. The Crown is always going to have an interest in that. Also with encumbrances. So an encumbrance is anything that stops us from doing something on a piece of land. So, or anything that's lodged on the title. Development plan is not lodged on the title, by the way. So you don't typically talk about development plan as an encumbrance, although it stops you from doing stuff on a piece of land. If you've got a piece of land which is light industrial zoning, you can't go building your house there, or in some city. So encumbrances stop you from doing things on a parcel of land. Such an encumbrance might be an easement, which is, and I'll show you some easements in a minute, so that might be a right of way or where you've got power lines going across your property, you can't build underneath it. You've also got developers' encumbrances, so when, let's say I'm Delphin and I go doing a massive subdivision. Because I want to sell those parcels of land to people who want to build fairly homogeneous type houses, they want to have that security that the development is going to look like this. So as that developer, I will lodge encumbrances on every single title in that development to say, you have to have a colour-bond fence of 2.1 metres high, you have to have either brick or rendered facade, you've got to either have tile or colour-bond sheet roofing, for example. I set out all these guidelines as to how you can build, and that gets recorded on the title. It doesn't get recorded on the title in detail. It says developer's encumbrance number 116, blah, 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 and then you look that up and then you get the specifics of that. Other things are like you have to do a garden in your front yard within 12 months of building, things like that. So on that, so we purchased a piece of land, we got that certificate of title. There are still people involved that say this is what you have to do, and this is why, and that's lodged on the title. They have an interest in the land. Like we have an interest in the land because we bought it. They also have interests in the land. So your zoning requirements, that comes in under your development plan. And then there are heritage considerations as well. So let's say we purchased that piece of land. It's got an old settler's cottage on it from 1860 where Hans Hyson lived, right? It's going to have heritage considerations. We're not going to be able to bowl them over. In fact, we're probably not going to be able to extend onto it unless we meet some really strict guidelines. So heritage as well has a stake in what we can and cannot do.
That's the one I've got on my house in the landscape. So certain features have to be certain colours and that, and the fences have to be the same. And yeah. It's all about the colour.
Okay, so that'd be probably local heritage, I think.
Yeah, it must be.
Yeah, as opposed to state heritage.
Yeah, there's 3 houses together. They're all terrace houses.
Yeah.
1890, and the fronts have to look the same. You can't just go change them. Yeah, the colours have to match.
Yeah.
And the actual paint is listed on there. What sort of paint you have to get there.
Yeah. So it's all each to their own. So some heritage considerations are really onerous, and then others, less onerous. And it sounds like yours is very well documented. Yeah, so this is what you can and cannot do, and that can be a benefit to somebody who purchases it, or it can be detrimental. Like say you're a developer and you bought, a classic example was the House of Chow on Hutt Street back in the early 90s. A developer bought it thinking, okay, I'm going to knock this down, I'm going to do this and build this stuff there. And it was heritage listed, so they couldn't do that. They decided to ignore that. They brought bulldozers in at night time, knocked it over, and then they weren't allowed to build on that site. It took them about 10 years to get that sorted. So for 10 years, they're paying interest on their $1 million site or something because they contravened the state heritage listing of that property. So it can be massive ramifications, or it can just be simply like you have to have this colour, this colour paint.
It's just the front of the house, just obviously curb appeal.
Yeah.
But you can do whatever you want up the back.
Yeah. Yeah, and that sort of heritage listing probably adds, may add value to your place, because you know that the neighbours have that as well. It's got to maintain that appeal, and people like that. I'll just quickly got example of a specific title here, and I'll also grab the other one, the easements. So, certificate of title. So when you purchase a place, you get a certificate of title. Now, these used to be recorded in paper form. That if you went into the Lands Titles office, you weren't allowed, like you went up into the title room, you can't take a pen with you, you can only take a pencil, because that's where they had paper copies of everything. So they had one paper copy there in the Lands Titles office, and one paper copy that somebody owns themselves at home. That's all changed. It's all computerised, digital files now. And so if you purchase a certificate of title from the Lands Titles office, they'll send it to you as a PDF. And then you can print it off, whatever. You can go in there and you can get it printed off, fancy paper, it costs a bit extra, but it's all just electronic information now. But this is how it prints out. So you've got your certificate of title with your volume and folio reference. That's a unique identifier for that particular property. No other exchangeable parcel of land has that exact same volume and folio reference. Then underneath that, it shows the parent titles. So that was the old certificate of title for a larger parcel of land before this one was carved up into a smaller section. And then you've got title issued in 1996. Now that was not necessarily when this was carved up. That was probably when the electronic version of this was created. Got estate type, fee simple. So that is by and large the most common form of interest in property that you can have. So if you go out and buy a place, 99% of the time it's going to be fee simple. If you go and buy a sheep station or something up north, it's going to be leasehold interest. So Crown maintains ownership of all those parcels of land, and then they lease them out on 100-year leases. So obviously those 100-year leases are worth a lot of money, because you can make a lot of, run sheep on there for 100 years, keep making that money every year. So people will exchange, so those leases then have value. But it's a different type of estate. It's a leasehold. Same as a river shack or a shack on the beach or something. They're typically going to be, a lot of them have been changed now to fee simple, but traditionally they were always leasehold. And some places still are leasehold. And you've got to be aware of that as well. There's a bunch of river shacks down at Murray Bridge that were leasehold, and the state government did not want to freehold them. And when those leases expired, the people had to demolish and remove the shacks from those sites, and they owned nothing there afterwards. So there are situations whereby you do have to be very, very wary of these things. Because with leasehold interests, that's it. They expire at a given point in time, and there's no onus on the the state government who are issuing that lease for them to renew it. Another thing is native title as well. When say large stations, when their leaseholds come up, yes, that might revert back to native title if there's an agreement around that. But then under that it says, so estate type fee simple. Then it says who holds the interest in that property in fee simple. Then it goes on to what are we actually looking at? What is the description of that land? So it's not about describing it as it's got really nice soil with beautiful trees and a bit of undulation and whatever. It's about where are the boundaries? How do we determine that piece of land as something separate from another piece of land? And so this one, that's section 303 in the 100 of Onkaparinga in the area named Basket Range. So grab my pen. So it will be like 100 Volca Paringa, area known as basket range, section 303, like that. And then, now LA Hills Council don't like people subdividing properties, so you're probably not going to be able to subdivide it. Let's say we could, and we get that subdivision approval. Then we do, carve that up into smaller bits, and we'll have, say, deposited plan, number, carve that one into smaller pieces. That one will be allotment number 1, deposited plan, blah, 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 section 303, area basket range, 100 Volca Paringa. So typically, you're not going to see many parcels of land referred to as sections. You'll see them referred to as allotments. An allotment X in deposited plan, blah, 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 blah. So that tells us what that piece of land is. Then I referred to encumbrances earlier on, so things that are lodged upon a title that stop you from doing things. A very common encumbrance is an easement. Those easements are for things like services and access, typically. So if you've got power lines running across the property, you typically have like a 6 metre wide easement underneath that power line, whereby you can't go building on that easement. Now that's that rule in a very simple sense. Sometimes you can build on easements. It's about contacting the easement holder and negotiating with them to say, this is what I want to be doing. Does that still satisfy the nature of the easement? So let's say, for example, the power lines are 12 metres up in the air, and you want to build a house which is only 3 metres tall. That means there's from your roof, you've still got another 9 metres from your roof to the power lines. SA Power Networks might be fine with that. So if you have an easement lodged on your title, it's not necessarily game over. It's something that you have to explore. But sometimes it can be game over. Sometimes if it's an easement for drainage or an easement for access, and if it's a road that neighbours use, you can't go building your house on that road, obviously. That goes against the nature of that easement. It stops the people who own that easement being able to enjoy the nature of that easement. So that one, no easements, and schedule of dealings. So it's got a mortgage lodged on it, so that's difficult. Yeah, Toby?
Is there any legislation saying you have like a creek running through your property? Is there anything that means you can't build close to that? Or?
Yeah, yes, there is. The main thing that stops you from doing anything in that regard is the SA Health guidelines. So the SA Health guidelines say you can't do a septic system within 50 metres of. You can't do a septic system within 35 metres of the watercourse, but you can't do the septic drainage within 50 metres of the watercourse. So, you can sometimes get a building close to a watercourse, but then that means you've got to run your septic to that position 35 metres away from the watercourse, and then you've got to do your soakage 50 metres away from the watercourse. The thing about a watercourse is typically they do this. Well, just about always, it's from the watercourse, from there to where you have to have your septic 35 metres away is uphill. And the question is, how do you deal with that? So that's the main thing stopping you from building near a watercourse, or the main bit of something written down. But if you put stuff into council to say, oh yeah, I've got a solution for this septic system. I can have some sort of holding tank within the house which is fully separated and it pumps, etc. to do that, and you've got a wastewater engineer that okays it and says that's not going to fail, that'll be good. Council might still say no. So you get over that first hurdle, SA Health guidelines, then council might go, yeah, but no, we don't want to do it. Or the EPA might say that as well. So EPA, Environmental Protection Authority, they look after, they look after the environment, and they may say, we don't want to have any building works, we don't want, they say, we don't want the risk of sediment going into that creek, sediment created by car parking and things like that, and gravel driveways and whatnot. So generally it's a very hard thing to do, hard thing to get by. Now, obviously some people do it, and they get it through council, and that's I guess one of the good benefits in employing an architect is that, or like a very well regarded architect. Some councils are a little bit, I wouldn't say scared of architects, it's probably an overstatement, but architects can have a lot more influence on getting some things through than say someone a building designer who's unknown, for example. Because you see some very well known architects doing some crazy stuff and you go, how on earth did they get that through council? So got all the information on that first page of the certificate of title. It tells us who owns it, who has interest in it, what parcel of land it is, etc. Then on the second page of your title, you typically have your survey plan image. So just like when we provide information to the council about what we want to build, we'll provide them with plans. So we say, these are the floor plans, these are the elevations, etc. And then we'll also have a document, the specification, where it's all written. Same as with the title. You've got written information, and then you've got diagrammatic information, because there's some information that you can convey so much better in diagrammatic form than you can in written form, and that is things like property boundaries. So we can say that angle there is 89 degrees and 56 minutes. You know, that one there is 90 degrees and 5 minutes, and the distance between them is 232 metres, 150 millimetres. So that sets out exactly where the boundaries are. So the surveyor can get that, look at it and go, okay, well, we're going to do our survey from this registered survey point up there, get this, the location of that little piece, that little corner there, and then they work out exactly where everything else is in relation to that. So that can be read by the surveyor. But also, as a drafter, when you have to go drawing up a site plan, that's where you get your site plan from. So you get that, scale it up in AutoCAD or Revit, like you import it, scale it up, and then just draw directly off of it. Or you can go, all right, start here and draw 452 metres and 20 millimetres up that way, and then draw a line 89 degrees 56 minutes from there, and so you can draw your site plan accurately from that information. So that's your certificate of title. Now that is an incredibly clean certificate of title. That's really simple. There's hardly anything on that. This other one here, I don't have the certificate of title for it, or don't have it with me, but this is a survey plan image showing the easements that relate to this other property, which is, you know, on the other end of the spectrum. There's a lot going on this one. So this is the allotment to which, you know, the other title I had, to which that relates. That allotment there, well, it's an odd shape, sort of hammerhead sort of shape, but it's got an easement C here, which is that funny little thing there. It's got easement A, which is this piece here, and then easement B, which is that piece there. And to access that portion of land, they have easement D lodged over this piece of land, which has a bit going on it as well. So we've got some infrastructure, so power box or something happening there. Can anybody think what easement A and B might be for? Where? Yeah, what did you say? Power lines, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it looks like power lines, doesn't it? And yeah, that's what they're for. This one, easement C, that's a funny one. That was for water supply. Yeah, you thought that?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Well done. Yeah.
Might be like a water tank there or something.
Spot on. Yeah. I should have got you guys to explore this one. Yeah, so there's a water tank there. There's a soak somewhere down here that they pump from, and then so when this subdivision happened, they put a water tank there, but they still wanted to have access to that water supply because there's no mains work there.
That road access that goes across that piece of land there.
Yeah.
What gives it away on that drawing to say that that's a road? Is there something on there?
No, there's not. What gives it away? So we've got this deposited plan, and then further up we have this schedule of dealings. Yeah, you have to sort of do that. Easement details, status, land, burden form, carrier, blah, blah. And from there, we've got our identifier A, B, C, and D. D, free and unrestricted rights of way. And then there was another document attached to this to explain the particulars of that. So typically, you have a survey plan image to show the location of all of these things. You have a document which summarises them, and then you have further documents attached specific to each one of those. So it'll say this is the person who owns that easement. So you have something like a survey plan image, like that larger one, and then you have a more detailed survey plan image that shows things in even more detail. So there are some things here showing fence lines. So it's showing a fence line that's inside there. That's telling us that the existing fence is not indicative of the boundary, not exactly indicative of the boundary. When we see things like that, we go, oh, actually, no, the boundary is slightly inside this corner fence, but it's slightly outside that fence. When somebody put the fence on there, they got it wrong. So surveyors will record things like that. They also show things like this. So there's a bit of corrugated iron. It says that shed is actually encroaching on that other property. So some things got a little bit out of whack at some point in time when they were doing fences and sheds and whatnot. So there's all that information that's shown in detail on there, and then we've also got our detailed directions. So all of our angles for the allotment there, like that. So that's something that's one that's a bit messy. You won't often see them that messy.
So if there's a building that's built wrong, I understand this has happened in America before.
Not this building, but yeah. So,
a building which is built on someone else's boundaries, and then they charge you for rent for that.
Oh, I don't know actually. I don't know any cases of people charging rent for it. Typically, what happens is there's a realignment of boundaries that happens, and you have to pay for a surveyor to come out and do the survey for the realignment of boundaries. That might cost you about $5,000 to do it. It's not a cheap exercise when it comes to something that might go to court, because surveyors, they go, all right, well, we can go out and do our job, but then if we have to stand up in court to defend that, we want to be paid more. So for things like that, for significant disputes, it will typically be a realignment of boundaries, and this will get changed, and you may even have a new title issued. So rather than have your old title reference, you get a new title issued that shows this boundary cutting across here to enable that house which was built on the wrong bit, that realignment of boundaries. With that other one we just saw, where there was a shed encroaching on that block, typically you wouldn't worry about it. But it costs you less than $5,000 to build a new shed. Just knock the old one down, build a new one if the neighbours have an issue with it. So it comes down to that negotiation with neighbours and often a realignment of boundaries. So covered National Construction Code. So previously it was called the BCA. So if you hear people talking about the BCA, that's what they're talking about. BCA, National Construction Code, it's not same. BCA was what came before it. So BCA was still a national document, but then you had all of your different state-based housing codes. So we used to have South Australian Housing Code. Then that was all incorporated into the National Construction Code. But having said that, there are still state-based things, and I'll get into that in a minute. So the Development Act, so that's an Act of Parliament, that spawns the development regulations. So I think it's Development Act of I can't remember off the top of my head, maybe it's Development Act of 1996, which brought about the development regulations of 1998 or so. And they're the current development regulations by which we have to do anything. And they give council the authority to impose their zoning and require that you get approval of the council to do anything. That is all about to change. So we've got a new Development Act, or 2016 Development Act, which is in the process of forming new development regulations, which are intended to be implemented in 2020. So that's next year. Those new development regulations, I don't know much about the changes within that, but what I do know, or what I've got an idea about, and others have an idea about, is that you can, rather than individual councils being in control of what happens to specific developments, you can employ a certified planner to then put your plans through for making the planning decisions. So rather than go to your council, you can go to your certified planner who can make those planning decisions on the council's behalf. Have any of you heard of a private certifier before? Yeah, had dealings with those? Or?
My boss from my last job was building a house. He had a really good one, certified. But then he was having issues with the council just taking forever. And so these things are designed to help speed up the process. Is that what they use?
Yeah. A good private certifier is a good person to know. They'll charge you $500 or more for their services, so sort of around $500 for a simple residential thing. They deal with building rules consent. So you've got, I think, is it on the next? Yeah. We'll look at things a little bit out of step, but that's okay. So when we apply to do a building, we get planning consent from the local government, but then we also have to go for building rules consent. And building rules consent is, does that building comply with the National Construction Code and all referenced Australian standards? A private certifier is a person who can make those decisions to advise council that yes, it meets all of those things, council will accept that, and then give you approval. So the reason you'd shell out that $500 is because if you're working directly with that private certifier yourself, that private certifier can say, Mike, just make these changes and it'll be okay. Whereas if you lodge your plans with council, so you've got planning consent and you lodge for building rules consent, it might sit there with council for 6 to 8 weeks. They look at it and go, oh yeah, that doesn't meet it, no, send it back. So you get that, make the changes, send them in, sit there for 6 to 8 weeks, oh that doesn't meet it, send it back. And so that's why you want to have that private certifier, and a good one, on board to have that relationship so they can go, yeah, just change this and this and this, I'll sign it off, it can go through. It appears that we're going to have something very similar in a planning sense as well in a few years' time, where rather than submitting your plans to council for planning approval, you can submit them to a certified planner. And it would not surprise me if we've got private certifiers who are also certified planners, give the whole lot to them, they work it out and go, yeah, just do this and this, and it's game on. So that's that's probably what we're going to. That's probably the new thing we're going to see coming out of the new Development Act. But the reason we have these Development Acts is because we don't just want people or entities like developers simply making decisions about things. Right? So there's it's a very common thing around the barbecue for people to talk about. I've got no idea how that thing got built. That thing's really ugly. Blah 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 blah. Right? Yeah. Okay. We've all been there. Yeah. Or even worse, like, why do we have this heavy industry right next to a school? Or, why do we have houses here when they get their groundwater out, tetraethyl chloride in their groundwater? We want to ensure that these types of things don't happen, and for that reason, we have overarching bodies like local councils that separate land uses and ensure that people who have dog minding facilities are out in the countryside and not in a residential area, etc. So that's why we have all of those zonings. So National Construction Code deals with things such as structural sufficiency. Is it going to stand up? Fire safety. If there's a fire, is everybody got to get out okay? Health and amenity. If we're living in that building, is that going to be detrimental to our health? So ways in which buildings can be detrimental to our health is if you've got mould growth from condensation in buildings, if you have inadequate light and ventilation, we still have mould growth and so on, but also it won't be a very nice place to live. That's about it. That's controlled by the NCC. Access and egress. That's things like stairs. You can't build a staircase which is this steep. You can build a ladder which is that steep. That's sort of a way of getting around some of these things. But for staircases, there are rules around that. There's minimum widths of doors for required exits in emergency situations. So let's say we had a fire at the TAFE here, we wouldn't want to have to be going down a really tiny corridor trying to squeeze everybody down there. It would be disastrous. So there's some dimensional things around access and egress and energy efficiency. That's to ensure that buildings are not built which just use lots of energy. Now, so that's included in both Volume 1, so Volume 1 for commercial, Volume 2 for residential. Both of those have aspects that relate to the energy efficiency of the buildings. Energy efficiency for your commercial is different than energy efficiency for your residential. Commercial is more about having it certified by somebody else to say, yes, it's using reasonable amount of electricity or not in its operation. Whereas energy efficiency for residential, you can follow what's called a deemed to satisfy approach, whereas if you have this amount of insulation and this and this and this and this, you meet the National Construction Code. And that's actually probably another important thing to remember about the National Construction Code. When you read it, you'll see a heading, where you'll see headings for each section. One of them says performance requirements, the other heading says deemed to satisfy. There are two different ways that you can meet the National Construction Code. One of them is to read the National Construction Code to the letter and do everything it says. That's deemed to satisfy. So if you follow those instructions, you're deemed to satisfy the National Construction Code. But these performance requirements say things like, okay, a building can't allow the passage of water inside the walls. So the deemed to satisfy will say you have to have a gutter of 110 millimetres with a slope of 1 in 200 and a downpipe at every 10 metres maximum, or every 12 metres maximum. So that's the deemed to satisfy recipe. The performance requirements will just simply say you can't have water flowing back into a building. You can follow the performance requirements and get around the deemed to satisfy. Let's say you wanted to do a gutter that didn't have a 1 in 200 fall, but it was much bigger. You could do that and it would stop water getting back into the building. But it would require an engineer who is certified in that aspect of design to say that gutter meets the performance requirements of the National Construction Code. So we can't just make decisions unless we're engineers. If we are an engineer, yes, we can make those decisions and put those in specifications. But if we're not, we can't just go making that. But that enables us to step outside the bounds of the National Construction Code. Or like if we were to do timber framing, we've got AS 1684, which is the timber framing code, and then AS 1720, which is structural design with timber. Both of those tell us how we can build timber structures. But we get plenty of timber structures built which don't comply to either one of those. So that's where you get a structural engineer saying, if we have these pieces of timber with this OSB sheeting, nail laminated at this, we can do this thing with it. Like that. So there are plenty of solutions that still meet the National Construction Code, but because they step outside of the deemed to satisfy all the Australian standards, they need to have engineer certification for that. So, National Construction Code, Australian standards. Have either of you accessed the Australian standards yet?
I looked at them when I was doing my apprenticeship, but I haven't downloaded them yet. So that'll be something that I'll put in my library.
Yeah, but beware that if you just download them, then they time out. So, yeah.
Can't you access them through that Learn portal? Is it? I'm sure.
Yeah, you access them via the library.
Oh,
yeah. Okay. So I'll go into how to access the Australian standards. So I went into the National Construction Code last week. Didn't I? To show you where to get that from. Did I do that? Should we do that again? Maybe I didn't. I get confused. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's just like.
So I'm only saying that just because I'm doing that external course.
Yeah.
And when I was reading through there, the lecturer said, "No, you can access it through this." I thought it might be, it's probably the library.
In the library.
It's free.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
Get it free.
TAFE had 3 licenses.
Yeah.
And yeah, typically toward the end, beware at the end of the semester when everybody's trying to access the Australian standards, those licenses, sometimes you go there and it's like, oh, you can't have access, can't have access. But keep trying. But yeah, because those licenses are expensive. But yes, we have 3 licenses available through the library.
So 3 people can access it at one time, or are those licenses multiple people?
No, so only 3 people could be accessing it at one time.
Okay.
But it very quickly times them out. So yeah, so if that's happening, keep trying. So we'll have a look at accessing Australian standards after this. So Australian standards tell you in detail how everything should be done. So I referred to Australian Standard 1684, that's a timber framing code. That tells us how we go about building walls and roofs, etc., with pieces of timber, how they should be joined together, what sizes they should be for what span and length and height, etc. We've also got, let's say we'd have Australian standard, I don't know what it is, but there would be an Australian standard for carpet. To say carpet has to be this. Or there'd be Australian standard for paints, for internal finishes. An Australian standard for the manufacture of plasterboard. Australian standard for glass, that's 1288, AS 1288 says how a piece of glass has to be manufactured and what defects it can include, what defects it can't include, etc. So whenever we do anything, typically we need to have approval. Now some building activities are exempt from approval, so the development regulations set out buildings of this size, etc., of this nature, under this particular value, don't need to have approval. So that's the development regulations that say that. Then you've got your individual councils, and they go, yeah, but this one does need approval. Right, so what the council says goes on top of the development regulations. Now you can debate that with your councils and whatnot, but typically it's things like a small garden shed won't need development approval. But things such as new construction of a house, demolition or removal requires approval. Excavation or filling incidental to construction or demolition requires approval. If we're just digging a small hole, well then that's not going to require approval. A lot of councils have information sheets to saying this is what doesn't require approval in our council area, and they'll say removal of 8 cubic metres of soil will not require approval, or something like that. So some sort of volume of soil. But typically, if you're digging a big hole, council want to know about it. Or if you're cutting a road in and you're going to have runoff from that, or if you're cutting a road in from a road reserve onto your property, well then definitely council want to know about that. And you shouldn't do that without council approval. If you're going to make structural alterations, so sometimes people, you get a bit of a smile.
Oh,
You've done that?
no, coming up to that, yeah. I mean, it happens all the time. Yeah. Like I'm around my mate's house and they've done something.
Yeah. Like,
should you be doing that?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's where look, definitely structural alterations happen. What happens inside a building, generally council don't know. But I guess what you don't want to be doing is making some structural alterations to a building, stuff falls down, somebody's hurt, then you're in trouble, because council will know, your insurer won't insure you because they'll say, well, you made these structural alterations without getting council approval. We had no idea that was going on. We're not going to insure you for that. So it becomes risky to be doing that sort of thing. But also, if you're a licensed building contractor and you go, well, we can knock this wall down, I'll put in this post here and this beam without getting council approval for it, you then take on that liability personally, and your insurance might not cover you for doing that. So for many instances, it sort of pays to follow the letter of the law. And then in the development regulations, they've got this funny bit that says any other prescribed activity. So just to cover all bases, to make sure that council can tell you what to do about what they say any other prescribed activity. So for development approval, you lodge an application to council. The approval consists of planning consent and building rules consent. Planning consent goes to the council currently. Building rules consent can go through the council or it can go through your private certifier, whichever you choose. Planning consent is assessed against the development plan, so your zoning and what it says in there. So you've got your development plan consists of council-wide objectives. So let's say Marion Council will say we are a flat piece of land with some shops and things like that. They'll have a general picture for the council and they'll say we want residential development to be this, we want industrial to be this, etc. So you have council-wide objectives and then you have your zone-specific objectives. So you have residential zones and then you have residential 1A, for example, and it will say residential 1A will allow detached dwellings with an allotment frontage of no less than 10 metres, things like that. Or then they might change the zoning. So you might have been residential 2, which says you have to have an allotment frontage of no less than 30 metres. Then they change your zoning to residential 1A, says you can have an allotment frontage of 10 metres. And then all of a sudden developers come in, they go buying up everything around the place, knocking everything down and chopping it up into 10 metre frontage houses. So your individual zoning constraints tell you what you can do specifically with that, but the council-wide objectives say this is what we want council-wide. So that might be things like overlooking and overshadowing. Say from 2 stories, we don't want people looking into backyards, that sort of thing. And then, so that's your planning consent, and then your building consent is assessed against the National Construction Code and Australian standards. For getting any of that approval, you have to supply documentation. So you supply plans and specifications to the council. And that's what you guys are pretty much, I think, here for, is learning how to do all of that. Get that stuff packaged to council to get it through. That's going to be the bulk of your work as drafters, and particularly this bit is going to be the bulk of your work as drafters. So producing those plans that have all the information on it to say this is how the building is going to be built, and this is why it complies with all the Australian standards and National Construction Code. But with your plans, you also supply a specification. So you have diagrammatic representation of the building, and then you have written representation of the building. The reason we have written representation of the building as well is because on our floor plans, we don't want to say carpet, plush pile, grey colour with a mottled pattern, eggshell white walls, matte finish, Dulux, blah, blah, blah. We want all of that stuff to be, because if we include all that information on our plans will just be covered with text, and it'll be very difficult to read. So some things you do need to show on plans. All the distances, everything that's essentially that can be measured is really good to show on a plan. So how large the door is, how large the windows are, how high the ceiling is, well, that's drawn in the section. But everything that's happening in a horizontal sense is drawn on a plan. Everything that's happening in a vertical sense is shown in either an elevation or a section. Does everybody know what a section is? Yeah, cool. So that's all so actually, rather than plans, I probably should say drawings, right? Because you supply drawings to council, but then you also supply a specification. A really good thing to remember when formulating all of this is do not duplicate information. If you say, like manor red roof on your plans and manor red roof in your specification, and then your client says, actually, no, let's go for heritage green. And so on the plans you change, okay, yeah, heritage green, forget to do that in the specification. And the builder goes and buys, manor red because they read the specification. And yeah, and then your client goes, oh, hang on, but we had green. You want to ensure that you don't have that duplication happening between things, because then that puts the onus on you to be remembering where all the changes have to happen. So, really good tip, when you're formulating those, try not to duplicate information anywhere. But you also have engineers' reports. So, what we're probably not going to be designing are footings. We probably won't be designing large steel cord frames for taking, weight, for creating large open plan living areas, etc. So we'll have engineers design those things, and they will specify how that happens. We also have to show the council that we have indemnity insurance, or that the builder carrying out the work has professional indemnity insurance. It's a funny thing that within South Australia there is no legislation to say that you, as a building designer, need to have any qualifications. You could just walk off the street and go, oh yeah, I could design a building. Design someone a building, right? And then the builder has to build it, right? The builder needs to go through a whole lot of stuff to get that license. But as the building designer, you don't. But as the building designer, you get to tell the builder what to do. It's a bizarre situation. But basically, the difficulty is if I just rock up and go, oh yeah, I'm a building designer, and I do this stuff, right? And I tell a builder how to build it, and the builder builds it as I told them, and it falls down, kills somebody, lands on me. And if I don't have professional indemnity insurance, lands on me. And that's the thing, to get your indemnity insurance as the building designer, you're going to have a hard case to sell to QBE or whoever you get your insurance through to give you insurance if you have no qualifications, no experience, etc. And if they do give you insurance, it's going to be really expensive. So while we don't have any laws to say you need to have done study, etc., to get that insurance, you need to be able to show the insurer that you can do that, to get that indemnity insurance to cover you above. Also to council, you have to show that you've paid the CITB levy. So for every building, every development over a certain value, you have to pay CITB levy. That's Construction Industry Training Board levy. And that CITB levy goes to pay for facilities like the TAFE, etc. So TAFE gets money from them, but also pays for apprenticeships and things like that. So, so probably, as an apprentice, that was partly funded by CITB.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so for any of that building work, or for any of those applications, you got to pay the CITB levy.
Is there anything over 40 grand?
Is it 40 grand, is it?
Oh, that's what I don't know if that's council specific.
No, it won't be council specific. I thought it's less than that.
Okay, maybe it's changed.
But yeah. Because as with everything, it's these will just keep going down and down and down. Like, for your indemnity insurance, it used to be for anything over $12,000, which is still the formal thing. But there will be councils that say, but anything under $2,000, anything over $2,000, we need indemnity insurance for. So that's sort of the nature of things. But when you're putting in your application, you have to have application forms as well that include all that information, and then pay your fees. So site plans. So all this stuff you're going to be hopefully incredibly familiar with in a year or so time. For planning approval, you need to put in a site plan, probably locality plan, floor plan, and elevations as a minimum. They might ask for other things as well, like if you're doing stuff in prominent locations. They did something on Melbourne Street. They wanted like a mocked-up visual of exactly what it would look like in that location. It really all depends on the area you're working in. But yeah, that site plan's got to show things like easements. So they're going to see where they want to know where a power line is going through, because if you don't show easements on there, the council might check the title. In fact, that's another thing that you include with your application, by the way. Council might check the title. But if you don't draw on your site plan where an easement is, they don't necessarily know that you're not building on that easement. And certainly SA Power Networks have got no idea because nobody sent them anything. So you need to include all your easements and things like that on your site plan. You need to show adjoining boundary features. So if you've got a building, a neighbouring building built right on the boundary, council want to know about that, one, for fire separation. So whether you don't want to be within 900 millimetres of that, or if you are, then you need to have non-combustible materials or that sort of thing. But also for excavation next to footings. If you've got a house with footings right on the boundary, and then you dig a massive big hole next to that, the whole thing can fall over and fall down. So footings need to be footings need to be contained on foundations, which is that soil. If you dig that soil away, stuff falls down. So for any adjoining boundary features, location of works and other features. So what are you doing on the property? And so here you probably can't see it that well, but there's a dimension here. So it says this is where the boundary is. They show a dimension from that to there, and there'll probably be so there's another dimension here with that dimension and that dimension reference to our floor plan. We can work out exactly where everything else is. So they want to know inverts, so how you're getting across the footpath and the rest of the road reserve. They might want to know about water table level. Typically in areas where there's groundwater close to the surface, councils don't like you building anyhow, and they may knock you back on other reasons. But maybe a consideration. Bench levels or finished floor levels. Council want to know, how much are you cutting into that site? Typically, councils don't want you cutting in too far. They don't want really tall retaining walls, which might fall over or something. If you do a retaining wall over a metre, that has to be engineered. It needs development approval for it. Anything under a metre, you can actually do without engineering and without development approval, unless your council say you need to.
So do you have to have an engineer say if you can you build something and when level over engineer it, give yourself a safe margin and then get an inspector come in and say, this is blah, 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 and then they can tick you off. Or anything, like just anything to do with the building process, like, your slab, rather than having an engineer come and say, whatever, you can say, I've got stable ground and I've got a 200 mil slab, so there's plenty of leeway there. Things like that.
So the correct answer is no. Like, it does depend on your council area. Some council areas will let you put stuff in. Yeah, I probably shouldn't say more than that, but yeah. Yeah, letter of the law is, yes, you should have things engineered. Where it says you need to have aspects engineered, you should have them engineered. It doesn't cost a huge amount of money to do so, and the liability then goes on the engineer that specified those things. Look, as a building designer, you can take on some extra stuff. Generally, it's not advisable that you do that. You've also got to show on your site plan how you're getting rid of that water. So that's a big bone of contention for councils. Is, let's say we've got a big storm event and the water flows off over here into the neighbours. And it keeps going into the neighbour's backyard all the time. This guy's doing nothing about it. That's a problem for councils. They get that happening all the time. Because water, like land slopes, wherever it is, water goes somewhere. Council want to see that you have these little dotted lines on here showing your stormwater discharge to what's called the street water table. So you'll go, 9 mil downpipe, SW2 street water table. That means it's going to the curb, and then after that, it's the council's problem because they have drainage, etc. to deal with that. Although that is changing a little bit. What's happening where you've got, like, I know Mitcham have got it in place and Tea Tree Gully have got it in place now, where they don't want people's downpipes going directly from the roofs to the gutters, because with a lot of higher density development, so people are knocking down houses on large allotments, carving them up, doing houses which take up pretty much the whole allotment, and the bit that's not built on is probably paved. There's a lot of runoff coming from these places. Councils now want to, in some areas, they want to see that you have a water tank on site that takes that water and then has a little outlet halfway up attached to a small pipe to ensure that that tank fills up in the rainfall event and then lets the water out really slowly over the next couple of hours. So you get a little trickle into the street, not a big gush into the street from your downpipes. Because when everybody's downpipes are gushing into the street, you get culverts blocking up and things like that, and then roads flooding and so on. So that's called a detention tank. But quite often what ends up happening is people build a detention and retention tank. So retention is about water that you retain for your own use, and detention is water that you detain for a certain period of time, a couple of hours. So that's just a tank like that. It's got the outlet here. This tiny one has a big outlet here for the use around the garden. That bit stays full all the time. The rainfall event, this bit fills up and it trickles out. So councils are stipulating that now in certain areas as well. So that's site plans, floor plans. So site plan is going to be either 1:500 for large blocks, 1:200 for smaller blocks. Floor plans are typically going to be a scale of 1:100. What we definitely don't do is just make up our own scales. We don't go, oh well look, 1:333 fits really nicely on the page. The reason we don't do that is because sometimes for certain elements, builders or council inspectors or somebody has to scale off plans. They have to use their scale rule, I add this, right, for various different things. Also, people get used to scales. like used to plans in a certain scale. So you look at that and you go, oh yeah, that's 2100 high window, 1800 wide. In 1:100, you end up being able to go, oh, that's what that is. That's what that is. If we can make out scales like 1:250, which you can still sort of scale off because it's easy maths, it's just difficult to just look at it and go, oh, that's what that is. So we have standardised scales, and councils say that on their websites. They say we want locality plans at 1:500 or 1:200. We want floor plans at 1:100 or 1:50. We want sections 1:50. We want details 1:20, 1:10, 1:5. They stipulate that on their websites. So floor plans, elevations show the building on the side. So in elevation, as we're looking at it, they're not scaled for perspective. We don't draw an elevation and have the sides sloping down or disappearing to that whatever they call those points, the vanishing point. When we draw an elevation, it's like that section of wall there is 6 meters high. That section of wall there is 6 meters high. It is just flat like that. Floor plans are drawn as if you're chopping through the building at 1 metre height from the ground, and then you're looking down on it. So anything that's within that 1 metre, you show on your floor plan. And then sections are as if you're slicing through the building in a sideways fashion, if you're looking at it like that. And specification is all your detailed stuff like carpets, floor finishes, things like that. So private certifiers, we talked about private certifiers before. Fine. After you've got approval and start works, you still have to notify council along the way. The involvement doesn't stop at that point. They want to know when you're going to start digging. They want to know they want to know before you pour concrete in your footings. So you dig holes, you put in a plastic membrane to stop moisture coming through, and then you put steel inside there. The size and the spacing of that steel determines, how strong that slab is. Council want to see that you put the right steel in there. The engineer will want to see that you put the right steel in there before you cover it with concrete, because once it's covered with concrete, nobody knows what's in there. They'll have to be notified at roof framing stage.
Do they have to actually come out to site, or can you just take pictures?
All you have to do is notify them. Give them 1 day's notice to say we've got stuff in place at 7 o'clock, tomorrow or the next day, whatever, we'll be pouring concrete. It's up to you to come out. That's all you have to do, is you have to notify them. And it's up to them. Look, it really doesn't happen a lot that council comes out. I mean, sad fact. That might change after things like Opal Tower in Sydney, where just so much stuff was done with little regard to actual correct practices. Things like that might change a bit, and people from council might start visiting sites again.
Is that the one used with the cracking the walls?
Yeah. You've seen that? You seem to. Yeah. So it's something that's been on the news a bit. So it was a new development. I don't know how many stories it is. Something like about 12 stories high, something like that. So it's a very large residential development. I haven't seen all the information on it yet. Exactly what was wrong. But stuff that I have seen is that so for big concrete pillars that start in the basement and head all out and take all the load of the building, because there's a lot of weight. In a 12-story building also, there's a lot of weight bearing down. Those concrete pillars have to be to a certain design with certain dimension steel rods inside them, set off a certain dimension from the edge. So if you don't have enough concrete on there, then it can pop stuff out, things like that, and that's what's been happening. So formwork was created badly, steel was installed incorrectly, you had concrete panels put in that had steel in the wrong place. So just quickly, if we have a concrete panel like that, spans from this point to this point here, it wants to do that. If we park a a concrete truck on top of that, a lot of load on top of that, that concrete panel wants to do that. To resist that, we have steel work toward the bottom of the concrete panel, because that's where it's in tension. If we put that steel work at the top of the panel, then it just cracks straight through as soon as we put the load on. And we'll get into that a little bit more later on when we're talking about concrete. But so we've got things like that were happening in that tower. Like steel work being placed in concrete panels in the wrong location. So grout. So you've got non-shrink grout that goes between panels. Yeah, that's inadequately done. You saw that one. Yeah. So yeah, a multitude of things gone wrong, and so there's going to be an engineer that's going to look really bad. Some engineer at some point in time was meant to be checking all these things, and they didn't. That's probably pretty much the fallout from it.
Did they have any cases where the steel's too far out and then rusts and
Well, it's only about 4 or 5 months old, this building. So yeah, so it's not rusting yet. A really interesting thing, if you look at the floors through here, there was some sections of the floor, and when they built this, end up being cast too high, so they cut them down, and you can see the steel work just under the surface if you look. But that is a major. Also, for steel work, you need 25 millimeters minimum coverage for internal, and then for anything external, you have to have 40 millimeters coverage minimum. If you don't have that, as you were saying, it rusts. When it rusts, it pops the concrete away from it. You no longer have that bond between steel and concrete. And, yeah.
If the council members come out and they see, just out of interest, if they see a lot of dirt on the road, do they get gripey about that, like where all drives and traipse? Because I actually had accidents with that.
Yeah, so it's the EPA that worry about that,
Yeah, okay.
but council will do EPA's work for them, for sure. So, because the EPA can't be everywhere, they're not going to be scooting around and checking everything. They want to ensure that you have dust and sediment control in place. So dust control is about having your shade cloth on your fence around there to stop that dust blowing in. And sediment control is about ensuring that you don't get four-wheel drives taking lots of mud out onto the road, etc. Or if you do, that you have these little bunds placed around the culverts, or where the water will go into the drains, to catch all of that sediment. So have you seen those little bunds everywhere? Those
weird things that stick out of the road. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah,
I think I've got that last week.
Yeah, like little mesh sausages. Like, well, not little, like, when you talk about the size of sausage, but like, this sort of fat going around like that let water run through them.
Yeah.
So water can pass through them, but it catches all the sediment, stops all that sediment going into the drains.
Yeah.
But you can do that also with hay bales and straw bales as well. So on some larger sites, rural sites and so on, where you've got a lot of water heading down a newly constructed road, you do hay bales there, join them all together. Water goes through that, but leaves all the sediment behind. So yeah, EPA are definitely worried about sediment control, because naturally you don't want lots of this stuff going into our creeks and the Patarunga and torrents and so on. But yeah, also EPA are worried about leak dump and things like that as well. So people chucking asbestos somewhere or whatnot. But definitely council will tip them off. Well, not definitely, not all the time. Council will tip them off, but quite often. To carry out building works, or to be able to contract for building work, you need to have a builder's license. So once again, there are plenty of people that don't have builder's licenses that contract for building work. One thing is, once again, with insurance, you can't go getting your indemnity insurance until you have your builder's license. So if you go carrying out work, people over the value of $12,000, if you don't have indemnity insurance, you won't be able to get that through council, unless you tell council that the value of the work is less than $12,000. But then, if they're found, if you're found to be contravention of that, then you face a fine, all that sort of stuff. So basically, in a nutshell, if you're contracting for building work, you have to have a builder's license. That's controlled by the Office of Consumer and Business Affairs. So if you want to have a builder's license, you have to go to them to get that builder's license, and there are various different avenues for that. So one way of doing it is you do some study, study building course here or another institution, and then you go and work for a builder. You spend time and you get plenty of experience in every aspect of building. Once you've got a bit of experience, you go, yeah, I think I really know what I'm doing here. Then you go put in your application for the builder's license and site supervisor's license. So you've got contractor's license, but then also site supervisor's registration.
But then the builder's license is also a multi-tiered thing, isn't it? Because you can have one story, 2 story, 3 stories, and then it just goes up from there.
Exactly. Yeah. And you've got restricted licenses just for like plasterboard installation. Or for site works or something like that. So you can go, I just want to install plasterboard, right? And so you have a restricted license for that. Or you can go, I want 1-story residential. All I'm looking at doing is 1-story residential. All I'm looking at doing is additions and renovations. You can have a restricted license for additions and renovations. So you have to go through the Office of Consumer and Business Affairs. Now, to get your contractor's license, you could be an accountant or something. You could have no experience whatsoever in building, right? To get that contractor's license, that's the relatively easy part. You need to have at least $10,000 to a name, and you need to have knowledge of business operations, and you can't be an undischarged bankrupt. So if you've got those 3 things, you can get your contractor's license. But if you only have that $10,000 in the bank, then you need to be able to get you need to be pre-approved for insurance. And there's only 2 insurers that can provide that insurance. So you have to get that insurance in place and show that you've done some business studies. So there's a couple of things that are required for that. There's a legal studies component and there's a financial accounting component to it. So if you've got those things in place, you can get your contractor's license. But contractor's license isn't worth a whole lot in and of itself, because the really hard thing to get is this one, the supervisor's registration, which is what you're talking about with the restricted license. Within South Australia, if we contract doing anything, that building work has to be signed off by a site supervisor, by a licensed site supervisor. That licensed site supervisor also gets their supervisor's registration from the Office of Consumer and Business Affairs. And to get that, that's the one where you have to show that you've got a lot of experience in all these aspects. There's a couple of ways to do it. I did it recently, so I went through that process. I went through the process whereby, like, I showed that I've got the work with engineering and all that, and then sat the interview. So I went, can you please give me an interview, because I can prove myself in the interview without having all that experience on site, on the tools, and so on. And I went through that way. That's one way you can do it. The other way, which is much easier, probably the more foolproof way, is to do the study, be on the tools for a bit, get experience in everything, then sit the interview, and the interview is a much easier process.
Is that covered by because when I was doing my apprenticeship, that was a Cert 3 level, but then you could go on to do the Cert 4, which was that plus the business side of it. So is that then covered in the Cert 4?
Yeah, so Cert 4, the business component, that will then allow you to get the contractor's license.
Yeah. Cert 5, supervisors.
Ooh, don't know. I thought. Well, see, you can actually get it without doing any study, like I did.
Yeah, well, that's what the original boss had, because he'd never been trained, even though he was better than most builders out there now who have got. Anyway, he got the Cert 4 because he was going to take me on, and it was just a case of, well, he'd spent 7 years in the industry, and so they just gave it to him basically. So that's the thing. It's not just a cut and dry. You have to do this. You have to do this. You have to do this.
Now, there's certainly there are recommended approaches, because if you step outside the standard approach, it's much harder for you to get it. So if you don't have a lot of time on the tools, they will really grill you in the interview, and they'll make it really hard for you to get through that process. But you can still get through it, and I think that is a good thing, that there are all these different avenues of possibility for getting it, and that they allow people, you know, or if they haven't done this, or if they come from the other direction, they haven't done the study, but they've spent a lot of time on the tools, they will craft an interview that relates to that person. Okay, that person who spent a lot of time on the tools, do they know their codes and legislation and business and accounting side of things? Because if you can do all that, but then you've got all that experience on the tools, yeah, they're happy that you can be a good site supervisor. So there's various different approaches. But basically, to do the whole thing, you need to have both bits. You need to have, and so when you do the Cert 4, that includes the legal and financial aspects, which easily meets that. Also, you need to have experience and knowledge, required nominated references. So you've got to put people on there that will vouch for your experience and for your good character. And so it says building qualifications and supervisor experience. A little bit of that, but you can still make it happen. But then the next thing is, builders indemnity insurance. You really shouldn't be operating without it. For anything over $12,000, council won't let you apply to do any work without it. And then, obviously, you've got to pay a CITB. And if you're contracting for doing that, you're not going to write up your own contract. You're not going to you shouldn't. You're not going to make these things up. You typically get a standard form contract from HIA or Master Builders. So a lot of builders are members of either or both, because there's a lot of other services they provide, but one of the services they provide are standard form contracts. That standard form contract will just include everything that you want to be contracting for. But if you're doing some commercial work, so this is for domestic, for HIA and Master Builders, but for commercial work, you're going to have somebody draft you up a commercial contract or use a pro forma and then modify that. Because within commercial work, there's a whole lot more variation. For residential, we can say, this is what they're going to be doing, right? Within the bounds of that. When you get into commercial, it's far more each to their own scenario. So that's the legislation and so on that controls what we do on a site. It's not just all those people and bodies that will control what we do on a site. I'll go to this one here, if it lets me. Yep. The next thing for you to consider is what drives the design. Now, there's one for you, Toby. It's House Over a Creek. Yeah, I reckon that's Max. That was Max Pritchard was the architect for that. So does everybody know Max Pritchard or know of Max Pritchard? What's that?
I feel like I've heard the last name.
Yeah, actually, Max is retired now. There's Pritchard Gunner. So you'll see Pritchard Gunner Architects, and then Pritchard Building something or other. That's his son who's taken that over. So that, yes, yeah. But Max is the father. He's done so much around SA. Because I used to go installing water tanks and so on places. And just be rocking up at Max Pritchard places all the time. It's another one. Yeah, he's very prolific, but also very successful. He would get a lot of stuff through council. Right? He'd get that through council.
Is that shipping containers or?
No, it wasn't built with shipping containers, but it's that same sort of dimensions. Yeah. So and it's
awesome.
It's
Good idea.
It's basically what it is. It's like a bridge. You know, it's got the same structural format of a bridge, but then that's filled in to create a house. Yeah, with views either side.
So that was not like originally there, that sort of bridge, and was just thought
No.
about built a house on that bridge.
Yeah, I don't know that place specifically, but no, I don't think it was. No, although all that looks incredibly new.
Yeah.
All
I
those.
was wondering if there was an older one there, like an old wooden one before it's gone like.
Yeah, well, maybe, but
I think hard to get an engineer for them if you're, chucking your name on a structure that was made 100 years ago from iron rather than steel.
Definitely, yeah. So what you can do, you can get structural engineers to visit the site and make an assessment.
Can they actually do that? Can they go around with one of those hardness testers and take multiple measurements and then have the whole thing blasted and
Possibly, yeah. I don't know how they. I don't know how they go about doing that. Yeah. How they make that assessment for that specifically. I used to work for a structural engineering firm that did repair and reinstatement to buildings, like after fires and whatever. Most of that is just visual. So they go around and go, okay, that's get rid of that. That can stay. That's okay. Wasn't a lot of instruments involved. It was much more just sort of experience and visual assessments. But don't know about that. Probably do people know that house there? It's not in South Australia. It's in Victoria. That's along the Great Ocean Road near Apollo Bay. So just before you get to Apollo Bay, coming into it, that house sticks out from the cliff. You've seen it on TV a bit. It's a fairly iconic place because you've got I'm running a room here. You've got a cliff going like that, and your beach, or whatever. That house is built on a pole on that, and then the walkway out to it. So what we can see in this picture is the walkway and the house that just sits out there with 360-degree views.
So the pole goes straight down to the bottom of the cliff, or is it sort of cantilevered?
Pole goes to like a section of very steeply sloping land.
Okay.
So how they excavated it, I don't know. That would have been interesting. Probably an auger on a very long arm, and then concrete pump, fill it up. I don't know how they did the excavation initially. That would have been the crazy bit. But then they get concrete footings in there, and they form it up, and they concrete column, and that concrete column spreads out into sections, and then that supports that.
That bridge would be a brace to it as well.
That would, yeah. So the bridge would brace that, brace it back into the land.
Yes, they don't have any other steel threaded rope cable tying it down or anything.
No, there's none of that. Yeah. We'll get more into concrete and steel and engineering possibilities and so on as we move through. But basically, all this to show, your site will dictate your design. Well, it should dictate your design. Now, a site doesn't always dictate design. Sometimes people go, I want this house, I've got this land, get them together. That doesn't always necessarily result in the best decisions. What does result in the best or the better decisions is being reactive to your site, saying, okay, what are the client's needs? What's the site that we've got? How can we work best with that site? How can we meet our client's needs with this site being responsive to it?
So as a draft, obviously the architect would come up with the overall shell of what the building should look like, but then does that fall onto us to say, all right, well, this is a house in the Adelaide Hills where there's gum trees all around, then we need to use that sort of product that has this colour to it, so it doesn't look odd. Is that where, do we make that decision, or is that all the architect?
It really depends on who you're working for. So if you're working in a large firm, you typically get pigeonholed into being CAD monkey, where you're just doing drawings, and you might just draw up sections. You might be the person who's doing plans and elevations, and then someone else is doing structural modifications and so on. So for big firms, you get pigeonholed a little bit more. If you're working for a very small firm, for a single architect, they'll go, oh, okay, Toby knows a bit about this sort of stuff, I'll get him to do that. But then as your experience and your knowledge grows, they go, well, I'm charging out at $200 an hour as an architect. We're charging him out at $80 an hour. Let's give him lots of work.
Yeah.
So, but then also you're in that position of going, well, I know this stuff, but how about I charge you $120? Blah blah blah. So you increase your value as a drafter by knowing more, and so you both become far more employable, or you charge you have that negotiating power to negotiate a higher rate if you know a lot more. Yeah. So and that's it's a very difficult thing to answer because it's always very case specific. But essentially what you're learning and what the theme of the certificate for in drafting is about is, yes, these people, when they go out of here, they can work for an architect or a building designer and do that drawing work for them. But if I can give you some value on top of that to become, that's the hope. So we're looking at sites. Sites will dictate what we're building. If we've got this as a site, first thing we think about is, okay, bushfire considerations. And in fact, if we get a site like that, first thing I think is like, okay, CFS is going to require that I have 30 metres clearance around that. Native Vegetation Act is going to tell me that I have to pay for clearance and reinstatement of all those trees. It's going to be expensive. That's the first thing I see when I see something like that. But also beyond that, once you've got through that hurdle, you think, okay, bushfire prone area, we're going to want to have a little square building that doesn't have any entry points for flames and things like that, with non-combustible materials, etc. Because it's highly vulnerable in a place like that. Get a site like that, what do you see when you see a site like that? What's the first thing you think of? Hey,
Slow.
Yep. Toby.
You're going to want to have like big windows.
Yeah.
Like these.
So we've got, slope views. Alana. Yeah, well, they took the good ones, so yeah. But that's what I say. I go, okay, we've got sloping land. What have we got to do with that? But first of all, we think, wow, what a view! You've got to capture that, right? Yes, you might be thinking, okay, solar access, design for climate, all that sort of stuff. But first up, bang, oh yes, okay, we've got a view. What are we going to do about that? The first thing you think of when you see, well, Alana, what do you think of when you see that site?
First was what have you given me?
Yeah, exactly. How do I build on that? What are we doing there?
What is that, sea or snow?
It looks like snow. Yeah. You might think, oh, do you want to consider purchasing another allotment to build on?
It's like a distinct volcano.
Yeah. Yes. Do we have seismic activity? Do we have to design for seismic activity? Yeah. So site configuration. So what the shape of the site, is going to dictate what you do. Access, things like that. So if this is your access, you probably don't want to build in precast concrete panels, because how are you going to get them in there, for starters? So access will mean anything. So when I was talking about earlier on about excavating close to boundaries, well, here you don't have an option. That's what all this formwork is about, is to shore up this while they pour some concrete under there to underpin that so they can do their excavations and things. But things like that, that's going to add a lot of money to that, or a lot of cost to that building project. Things like that have to be considered. In fact, that's probably the most important thing that drives, is what's it going to cost? to do that. But you have to think, so you think about earthworks, think about retaining walls. So if you get something on a slope, well, to do all this, to have a flat building pad, whatever, you've got to do a lot of retaining walls. So all those retaining walls look to be 1 metre high. When you go over 1 metre, then you need, as I said before, you need to get that council approval for it. Very important, avoid building on the wrong lot. It happens. Yeah. In fact, it almost happened to me. A place over in Kangaroo Island, bush block, all these bush blocks, no pegs about the place, whatever, measured from, initially I got it wrong. I started doing a level survey and it's like, oh no, this is not the right one. Yeah. So it can be easier than you think to do that. We know about certificates of title, lot numbers, and so on. So we check all of that. We understand all of that. That's like our checklist. What we didn't mention before are liens. So if there's a financial debt against the property, has there? And that's an important thing, because if somebody, let's say a child, wants to hurry up and get their inheritance before they're actually due. Like, there's somebody else still owns the property, but that child is going like, oh, well, I want grandma's house and we've got to be doing these extensions, whatever. They employ you. You'll be wanting, you check the certificate of title and you go, hang on, this, it says Mavis Briggs on here. You're not Mavis Briggs. What's you want to check those things, or you want to check that if, say if you're a builder, you've done some building work on a property and that person decides not to pay you, you can lodge a caveat on that certificate of title to stop them selling that piece of land. But also, if that person has employed builders previously and they go and they didn't pay them, that caveat's there, and they'll go, oh yeah, Mike, can you go do this design work for me? You check the certificate of title, there's an undischarged caveat on there because they haven't paid somebody else. You don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. So you've got to be, it's important to check all these things. So you get the certificate of title and you look for that. So zoning, we know. Services, very important thing. Mentioned before, building next to a creek. So you have to meet the SA Health guidelines for on-site wastewater disposal. If you've got a sewer connection, well then you don't. So your sewer connection, that's SA Water's responsibility. As long as you get it to the sewer, that's fine. You don't need to have a septic system on your site. So services that are available are going to dictate things. If you've got mains gas, well then you might have instant gas hot water service. If you don't have mains gas, you probably won't have instant gas hot water service or gas cooktop or something like that. Underground power, definitely that's important. So we're working through that at the moment, which is an interesting scenario.
The Murray River, there's a floodline.
1956 flood level. So that's a really good one to bring up. So typically you're not allowed to build anything underneath the 1956 flood level. So because that's set as that's the maximum that has ever been recorded as the height of the flood, and they want to ensure that people don't have their septic tanks down below that, or anything else. So if you have a flood again, that fridges and whatever aren't going down the river. So that's a really good one. So got your titles, you're fairly well versed in that. Okay, that's a survey plan image. So that's a detailed development. That's actually probably a bit more of a common sort of survey plan image you get, something like that. And then you get your detailed allotment image like that. So there we go. What's that? What's that?
It's a road.
Well, actually, no, that one's an easement. That one specifically, that's an easement for water. So that's up at Houghton. So you've got North East Road, hitting Range Road South. Up at Houghton there, you've got this massive big concrete water tank on top of the hill and a big pipeline going down from it. So that's what that one specifically for. But yeah, first glance you go, oh, that's an easement for power. It's 6 metres wide or so in a straight direction. It's 5.26 metres wide. So yeah, but it's an easement. So some more survey plan images. Now, another thing that's going to dictate what you can do on a site is what's the soil like. So in South Australia we have different types of soils. We have, predominantly in South Australia, we have reactive soils. So that's soils that if you add moisture, the soil swells. The soil, clay soils, particularly firm clay soils, when you add moisture to them, they have a lot of strength for lifting stuff. There's that capillary action of the water mixing with the clay. It's actually quite a strong action, and it can lift things up. Those reactive soils cause a lot of issues. The really bad reactive soils we get are typically around Keswick, Newton, and Rostrevor. So former market garden areas, great stuff for growing things in, but really bad for building. You get massive movements of soil. That really becomes a problem when, let's say, so we've got a house, and we break it down like here, and nobody does anything about it. And that water soaks into the soil around here, so that's in plan view. What happens in elevation? That's exaggerated, but that's what happens. The clay soil heaves and cracks that building, and then you get, sort of step cracking and so on through the building. That is a big problem in South Australia, those reactive soils. To work against that, what we typically do is we build houses on a raft slab. So that's a concrete slab that if we cut through that concrete slab, it looks something like this. And then internal beams, with steel work in there. So when the soil lifts that up, it lifts the whole thing up, or the whole thing moves like this. I've done a lot of level surveys around houses to work out which bits are being lifted up and why. I think the worst one I've seen is 150 millimetres difference from one side to the other. So from this corner here to that corner there, 2 bricks worth picked up by the soil, but there wasn't much cracking in that house. And yet I've seen other ones where we've got like as little as 50 millimetres, well, 50 millimetres of movement is still a lot, right? But severe cracking as a result of 50 millimetres of movement. The difference is, if you've got something which is really localised, then that will cause cracking. If you've got even like a little bit of pressure here, more there like that. Let's say, for example, we've got a tree here like this, and its roots are going out to here like that. It's sucking moisture away from the whole thing, but it's sucking mostly moisture from here. You can have that 150 millimetres of movement evenly distributed over the house and get no cracking, or very little cracking. Or, you can have a lot of heave and then nothing, and then you get bad cracking. Or you can design a raft slab which is strong enough, that whole thing is strong enough to carry the weight of the building. So when your soil is heaving up in one situation, it just lifts everything up and drops everything down. Yes, you break pipes and whatnot, you've got pipes go through your slabs, that gets lifted up, you break pipes and things, that's a problem. But there's also measures to get around that as well. You wrap your pipes in this 10mm spongy rubber, and if it's really reactive soil, you use 2 layers of it to enable your pipes to move around a little bit like this with the heave in your soil. So sometimes before you even purchase a block, you get soil samples taken. It costs you about $500 to get an idea of what's down under the ground. Typically it's done with a not such a hardcore machine like that. Typically it's just like a Land Cruiser ute with a little push drill on the back of it. And you'll take those soil samples down to approximately 3 metres. So the Australian standard sets out that you have to go to a minimum of 3 metres deep. Plenty of engineers like the soil samples to go to 4 metres deep. So in South Australia we have deep-seated reactive soils, which means that some reactivity can be happening even down as far as 4 metres or so. So you get those soil samples taken, you get an idea of what that soil is, and an engineer does the bore logs. To do those bore logs, they look at those soil samples, they take out a piece of it, they crush it all up and go, is it friable, is it prismatic, does it react to moisture, etc. They will then work out how much, well they'll provide an estimate of how much expansion and contraction that soil will undergo in normal conditions. So you get an idea of the soil, because that's going to tell you how you can build. Or it's going to tell you how much it's going to cost you to build as well. So yeah, one fellow, I know he spent an extra $50,000. So typically your building contract has $10,000 allowance for footings. He had a $50,000 variation for his footings. So probably $60,000 or so just to build the slab, because there wasn't that consideration at the design stage to go, okay, building on a reactive site, we want something square, something simple, something without lots of corners. As soon as you build lots of corners, you've got lots of points for cracking, etc. You have to go crazy with your footings. You know, the lack of consideration at that early point costs you $50,000, $60,000 further on. You have to think about significant trees. You know, yes, it's, you know, you can't build a tree. It's good to keep trees there. Trees, you know, keep things cool, etc. They do cause cracking and do cause problems. They drop limbs on cars and buildings, whatever. But also, if you were wanting to get rid of trees, I guess essentially you want to know that you can actually get rid of it. And some trees you can't. So, or if you do, you face a lot of trouble from the council or significant fines. Yeah, does it have sewer? Does it have fencing, other building structures, rivers and creeks, etc.? I showed you earlier how you get, like, from SA Map Viewer, get the contours. So that they're on SA Map Viewer, they're just very, very general contours, right? It's not particularly reliable. You wouldn't rely on that for building, but you rely on that for an initial assessment without even going out to site. For making a contour plan, first of all, you draw up a site plan, so you get your title, draw your site plan from that, drop your trees in, whatever, from Google Earth, and then you head out there with your, well, there's the tripods there for the levels, for the laser levels, but you go out there and you take spot levels around the site, and you do that in a grid fashion. So you can relate those spot levels back to exact points on your site plan, from which you then work out your contours. So you do your contour plan. That's going to tell you exactly what you can build on a site as well. It's going to tell you how much it's going to cost for cutting and filling and things like that. You guys are going to learn Revit. There's really cool stuff in Revit. I don't use Revit myself because a bit of dinosaur. That's more of a newer thing. And the work I used to do, AutoCAD is far better for it. But on Revit, you can do things like you do a cut and fill plan, and it can assess, okay, how much cut have you got, how much fill have you got, how much dirt are you going to have left over that you have to take out and dump elsewhere. So there's some really cool features on that for working out all of that stuff. That's sort of more your contour plan that you'll be producing. So you take lots of spot levels and then you work out your contours from that. Or a surveyor might do that for you as well.
If you're building on a slope, does that then, if the slopes are harsh enough, does that then mean that don't you have to have a portal with steel wall frame, which is then engineered? Well, that's a good way of doing it, where you can save some costs.
Yeah, certainly. So Yeah, we'll get into portal frames and elevated floors and things further on. So, but yeah, a portal frame is a frame which is an autonomous structure in and of itself. So that yeah, we don't have any portal frames there, unfortunately. But yeah, portal frames are really good for creating open spaces or for distributing point loads far away from each other. So that can be a helpful thing for building on a sloping site. Yeah. It really all depends. So it depends on what your soil is doing. So this is a typical way of building on a sloping site where you have adjustable steel piers going down, and it's not the favourite way of dealing with a reactive site, but that's the best way of dealing with a reactive site, to have a raft slab. Something that's going to carry the whole building element. But what you can also do is, if you were to build on some steel adjustable piers and you're on a really reactive site and you've got a lot of moisture doing stuff, you can use an auger and cut a hole down into the ground, fill it up with concrete, you've got your reinforcing cage inside there or whatever, make that 3 metres deep, and get your builder's plastic stuff, sleeve the hole before you pour the concrete, which means your concrete locks into this soil down here, which might be 3 metres down, where you're not going to be getting any soil movement. That plastic on the sides creates a smooth surface to those piers. Soil can lift up and down, do whatever it wants. Soil goes up and down, and you have your concrete piers that you build your steel adjustable piers on top of. That's another way of dealing with a really sloping site, which might also be reactive. Yeah.
So that might have gone down past the soil and perhaps into bedrock or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So your soil samples, they're going to tell you, they're going to give you all of that information. Do I have some bore logs? No. Nah, it's not very good examples. But yeah, typically, so your bore logs are shown as a table. Within that table, it will say soil horizon, this horizon A is 400 mil deep. Horizon B is 200, so 2 metres deep, for example. And you'll have, like, horizon A is humus, soil that has lots of organic matter in it. That bit, if you're building raft slab, has to go. Then the next horizon B might be hard clay, highly reactive, with Y values, which means the ability to expand and contract at 100 millimetres. So that's extremely reactive. And then under that, you might have weathered rock. So you look at that bore log and you go, okay, well, we need to do piers at 2.5 metres deep. So the base of our pier is locking in to that weathered rock. And then the soil above that can do whatever it wants. But if your bore logs are saying you've got really reactive soil, like down to 4.5 metres or something like that, to the end of the borehole, then you might want to go further, or you might want to think about another approach to building. But exactly. So you go down to rock, you go down to weathered rock, you go down to. You don't really go down to sand, because if you're putting point load, a lot of load on a small surface area, 300 mil diameter pier, you want a lot of bearing capacity on the bottom of that. So you're not going to go into sand, you're not going to go into loam, things like that. So yeah, you want something with at least 100 kPa. Oh no, it's up to an engineer to say what pressure that needs to take. But yeah, you need to think about site access, material deliveries, trade access, etc. Probably all seen some crazy stuff happening on grand designs where people are just carrying stuff up through whatever. Yeah, it's not the best scenario, unless that's the only scenario. Yeah. Think about storage. So where materials are going to go, how are you going to get stuff to places? So concrete pumps are awesome. It means you join lots of pipes together, put concrete up there, even though you can only get a truck here. Plenty of solutions like that. Think about existing features, what you need to demolish. So demolition is expensive. Like, you can't just think, oh yeah, well that's, you know, that'll cost nothing. Like, typically you're spending $10,000 to $15,000 on demolition. So people I know recently demolished a place when it got to the bathroom. Underneath the bathroom, there's all these bits of asbestos and everything. They demolished the subfloor, there's bits of asbestos in the soil. Yeah, so demolition can be incredibly expensive when you start hitting things like that. Particularly when you've got asbestos in the soil, because it means you've got to cut off all this soil and you've got to pay for dumping, like secure dumping of all of that soil. Very important consideration. So, yeah, demolition can be very expensive. Tree removal can be very expensive as well.
Actually, we had that issue with asbestos, where me and my boss were redoing a roof. We were pulling off all the old iron off this, 30s building.
Yeah.
And then putting a new roof on and extending it out to a veranda.
Yeah.
But it was all fun and games, and we, got most of the roof off. And then right on the top corner there was a pipe that just had this, it was like a heat wrap.
Yeah.
And that was asbestos, and apparently that's the worst stuff. So
Yes.
even as builders, we're not really looking for that to move that. Because I think as a builder you're allowed to move up to 8 square metres of
non-friable asbestos.
yeah, like asbestos board.
Yeah.
But we weren't allowed to touch this stuff under
No.
the regulation, so then that was an extra cost for the client. So they had to come and get something out to they cut in some sort of box of wood or something, to fibres in and lift at the time.
Yeah.
That meant that we couldn't do any work after that.
Yeah.
Until that had been resolved.
Yeah. 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 So yeah, asbestos is it's a problem that keeps on giving. But yeah, definitely yeah. So you've got friable asbestos, non-friable asbestos. So that's friable asbestos is stuff that can be broken easily. So as builders, yes, you're not allowed to touch that wrapping. And in Canberra, there's a Mr. Fluffy installation installed way back when installed asbestos bats in roofs. Right? It's a massive problem because it's just bucket loads of friable asbestos that builders can't touch. But I think it's 10 square metres that you're allowed to remove, either as a builder or as an individual, as yourself, if it's asbestos cement sheet. And that can be cement sheet on walls, but you also got the corrugated roof sheet. Has anybody seen the asbestos corrugated roof sheet, Deep 6?
Yeah, I think I've seen it on all of it.
So that's non-friable asbestos as well. So that can up to 10 square metres you can remove, but you have to take it to a dump that can accept asbestos as well, not just any dump. So like down to Seaford, and you've got to check with your local dump so that they can take.
Do you have to damp it down and wet it down?
Yeah, so you should wet it. Yeah, you should wet it down. Yeah, and you should avoid breaking. And for proper disposal of asbestos, look on Safe Work SA, they have guidelines on asbestos removal. So if you're going to be removing asbestos, probably best protocol, refer to Safe Work SA, the website there. In fact, what you could even do is you go to Safe Work SA, download all their fact sheets and guidelines and put them in your filing system. So you've got all your site safety stuff there, but yeah, they provide guidelines on asbestos removal, how that should be done. But yeah, wetting it down is important. So adjoining properties, you're going to have to. Well, typically it's you have to see what's adjoining. Sometimes you're going to want to get a dilapidation report done. A dilapidation report is a report that records for adjoining buildings any problems that they already have. Because what you want to avoid is that you're building on your allotment, you're using a pile driver or something like that, creating lots of vibration, and the neighbours go, "You've destroyed our house." all this cracking has just happened since you've done that work. Now, if you don't have a dilapidation report in place, it's your word against theirs. Whereas if you typically employ somebody, you can carry that yourself, but typically employ somebody else. If they go around and they record every little bit of cracking, like a crack in the curb, anything like that, and document all that with photographs and produce a report to say, this is the condition that neighbouring property was in before you did any of the work, then you're covered in that, because then you go, oh no, you had that cracking here already, or there was this soil movement which is causing this problem. For the problem is not as a result of our work, it's as a result of pre-existing condition with the problem. So that's where you get a dilapidation report in place. Typically that's going to be for major works. You're not doing that for the standard residential stuff. Move through that. So this is more for building designer sort of thing, but if you're going to be taking on that concept and working, producing something for your client, I think in the Cert 4 you don't cover environmental aspects of building, do you? In yours, I'm pretty sure you won't. But yeah, probably can't get into it today. We've got 1 minute left. But the important thing for drafters is to understand that within the NCC, you've got stipulations about energy use of buildings. Buildings have to meet a 6-star energy rating, or you can go to deemed to satisfy, or you get an independent assessment of your building to meet that 6-star energy rating. If you get that 6-star energy rating, then it meets the National Construction Code requirements. That 6-star energy rating is going to be so much easier for you to achieve if your building is sited in a fashion that gets the benefit of the winter sun but doesn't have any summer sun flowing into it. If you have accommodation for cross-flow ventilation, so windows on both sides of the building that let breezes pour through in the evening. These are ways you can design for reducing your requirement on heating and cooling. If you design to reduce your requirements in regards to heating and cooling, then it becomes easy to meet the 6-star energy rating. If you can't do that, then you've got to go spending bucket loads of money on insulation and high performance glazing, and you've got to specify curtains and all sorts of things. Yeah, something I'm very interested in is design for climate zone. If we can go into that more further on, if you guys are interested in that or not, yes. Yeah, well, I'd love to go into that a little bit more at a later date as well. So that's sort of where we're at now. Look, I'll pick up from there next week. We do really have to start getting into the footing systems and things like that next week, but yeah, I'll cover this stuff next week. So energy efficient design, etc.
Very cool. Yeah, should we? We'll just carry on with those scrapbook and the files.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, just like I work with Toby with your that file system, which is fantastic. So yeah, gather stuff like that.
How many documents? Well, I think the ones you opened up probably had less in them. Like I had some of the interior painting. I had 7 or 8 products. How many product things in each folder do I need?
That doesn't matter. All I need to see is that you can logically organise these things. So, I'm telling you, produce this library of design guides because you'll need it, because you want it, right? That's super important stuff, and it's also really important to be able to organise and to learn the ability to organise that stuff really well. That's more for your benefit. Simply in terms of the assessment, I have to see that you're able to organise things and update things. So you get stuff in there today, and then throughout the course you update that and you add more things to it. That's the 2 essential things I have to check. So So yeah, so no requirements about numbers and stuff. That's all down to you.
So one note.
Yep.
I go to that top right hand corner because I think I've seen it on there, and it's that. So man.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like a silhouette of a person with a little plus next to it that says share.
And then I put your email address.
Click on that and put michael.jenkins@takesa.edu.au and it'll share with them.
And that's due next week, is it?
11th of March. So it's still 2 weeks, at least, yeah, it's 2 weeks away. 2 weeks. Yeah, 15 days away. So,
I still need help with trying to log to the website to find this. I'm still struggling.
right, okay. So I gave the learn key. Did I give you the learn key for that? Did I give the, yeah. Okay. Should we do that now? Maybe we'll do that, yeah. Because I can't. Oh, well, I can sort of backdoor log you in through mine, but I'll just have to stop this recording.